Thank you, everyone. Welcome to our Friday noon seminar. We're getting close to the end of the series. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming one of our own, someone who doesn't need any introduction, but will still do it. It's Professor Ives Levesque. He's one of the faculty here in the McGill Medical Physics Unit. Yves did his grad school in our program, correct? He did MSc, PhD, MPU, assuming with Bruce Pike. Yes, Bruce Pike, right, doing MRI research.
Yes.
Then you went and did a postdoc at a little school in California.
Yeah.
Then came back and
one room school.
Yeah, one of these other places. And now you're one of our MRI experts. So I'll let you talk to us about safety and MRI.
Yes. Great. Thank you for the introduction, Peter. Good afternoon, everybody. You can hear me okay, I hope. It's just that. So, is it safe? Some considerations for safety in magnetic resonance imaging. I realized over the years as I practiced clinically as a medical physicist and in research as well, that I was involved enough in magnetic resonance safety issues that it was bordering on research. And so today, what I'd like to share with you is some past, ongoing and preliminary work in the area of MR safety. And if it seems a bit unpolished, it's because it's really the first time that I talk about this stuff in public. So I have these disclosures, no commercial interests related to any of the topic that you see here. And most importantly, maybe, is that any copyright images that I've used here are for educational purposes. So if you're going to reuse them, please go to the original sources instead of copying right from my slides. A caveat, because some of the content here sometimes is delivered to international audiences. You'll see why. I'll talk about it a little later on. The guidance presented today is, or the guidance I quote from, is internationally recognized, but most of it is from the US, the UK, or from Australia and New Zealand. So there's a bit of a bias towards rich countries, MR advanced countries, and countries that have sort of a high level of healthcare system. And so any information I provide today, of course, if it's reused in the context of MR safety, should ensure that any policies and procedures respect local regulations and guidelines. So I want to share with you, to start, maybe my philosophy around MR safety. I'll give you a bit of background as to why I think this is important. For years, I had been trained to think about how to be careful about MR safety from the perspective of who shouldn't go in the MRI scan, right? Like, what is something that you might have in your body that will preclude you from going into MR? And I've noticed a shift in the MR community, and have adapted my thinking to it as well, that MR safety is ultimately really a team effort. It's not just one person who ensures that you have safe MR examinations. It's really a team effort to enable safe exams, not to exclude people from MRI, but to have as many people as possible undergo MRI examinations when they need them, and to do so safely. So our goals to achieve this should be to avoid unsafe examinations. We really shouldn't be doing anything that's going to put the patient at risk.
Yes, I want to revolt.
And to avoid any misinformed or inappropriate refusals of MR examination. We really shouldn't be walking around telling patients, you can't go into the MRI scanner because you have this thing inside you. Rather, we should be saying, well, what's the thing inside you and how can we enable an MR examination? So let's not refuse anybody on the basis of poor knowledge. And frankly, the biggest risk to patient safety, given those two goals, is failure to follow guidelines. So not knowing what the guidelines should be and how to act and how to follow them, or use of outdated information. There's always updates to information in the MR safety world. So you have to be careful that we're not holding on to old information. To be an example, over time, say maybe a decade ago, most implants had this sort of vaguely required waiting period between implantation and safe MR examination, which would be on the order of 6 weeks or so. And the reasoning was quite good. It was to allow for scar tissue to form around the implant and really securing it in place. But what we've realized over time is that a lot of implants can actually go into the MRI system the next day without that formation of scar tissue. And so these waiting periods aren't always relevant, but in some devices, they still are. So using outdated information can sometimes delay unnecessarily an examination. So we do have to be careful of this. So is it safe? Well, studies suggest a very low rate of incidence. I apologize for the small type on here, but I'll quickly summarize it. It's below 1% of MR examinations when you look at tertiary care hospitals, as reported in 2016. So presumably an American, it was an American group. They didn't state which hospital. Yep. Code blue, hopefully not at MRI. Nope, not at MRI. Okay. An even lower incident rate, reporting rate from a diagnostic imaging provider in the UK, a bit more recently in 2019. There aren't a lot of studies around this reporting on rates of incidence. Pediatric MRI incidence rates are quite similar to adult imaging. Again, below 1% of examinations. Now, you might say, well, 0.5%, that still seems quite a bit, but this really includes anything around MR examination, even like an incorrect form that had to subsequently be corrected is usually involved or usually reported as an incident. It's an incident that didn't reach the patient because it was caught on time, but still sometimes reported as an incident. So really quite low rates of incident reporting. One thing that's a little concerning is data from Denmark and Sweden. These are two studies that I found. There could be others from even more recently, 2020 and 2022, suggesting, based on surveys, some severe underreporting of MR incidents. So that stuff happens in the MR suite, stuff happens in the diagnostic imaging department around MRI, but it doesn't get recorded. People go on with their day, they forget it happened, and they moved on. In fact, one of these studies, and I forget which one, in the abstract of the article, there's a quotation of like radiographers reporting that burns are to be expected in MRI. So I sort of said, ooh, it kind of blew my mind a little bit. So, is it safe? Yes. Could we be doing better? Probably. Now, most of the time, when we talk about MR incidents, we really worry about projectile objects. These are ferromagnetic objects that are brought into the suite inadvertently. It's rare, but it's possible. So in a Japanese study reported in 2023, on the order of 19 incidents per year over 1,500 hospitals. So it's quite rare, but it does happen. Okay, where ferromagnetic objects are introduced into the MRI suite inadvertently. And the biggest reason, if I remember correctly from reading the article, was, it's just failure to check. Somebody just had not checked the patient bed going in and something went in with the patient. Oops, you've got a pair of scissors in the other important sort of patient-related or patient injury-causing factor are RF field-induced burns. And in fact, they are some of the most commonly reported patient injuries as reported by the FDA. Now, the data are a little old from the FDA, but nonetheless, burns are a high risk, sort of a high source of patient injury. Now, I spared you I put up the photo of projectile incidents, all these large objects being pulled into the MRI scanner. And if they all seem like old photos and old scanners, it's that because they have happened a few times over time, but I have some more recent examples. I spared you the picture of the RF-induced burns. They are pretty gory looking, and they can go all the way down to 4th degree if the wrong kind of device is involved in the examination. So another thing that sort of keeps us up at night a little bit is that catastrophic incidents really do make the news. And these are recent reports, 2023 in both cases. They're both from the United States. I'm not pointing my finger at the United States because these have happened in India recently. They've happened in Sweden recently. They do happen in many places. The title on the upper left, this is a major news outlet which tends to scream high and loud whenever people get hurt. Don't need to name them. Their logo is up there. Bay Area nurse crushed in an MRI accident. This nurse fortunately survived, but had some major injuries. The second example is not from a news source, but from a sort of an online website that aggregates reports of MRI safety incidents. And in this case, this was a prisoner who was brought to MRI for an examination. Their waist shackles were left on. They were picked up by the MRI scanner, glued to the MRI scanner, and being hurt by the shackles at the same time. When the technologist asked for help from the prison guard got stuck to the MRI scanner because of their tool belt and gun. So at some point, there were some major failures in process, right? So these still happen today, and not just in countries that are new to MRI. So we do have to continue to pay attention. And this, at the end, it says, employees waited to hit the emergency shut-off button because the lead engineer had advised them to wait until they got there to do so. It just blows my mind. Anyway, most of you who are in the room here and some of the people who are online, you've already followed my MR safety training, or you've at least gotten some information through my class. You know that we have processes and procedures, guidance to do this. We teach people how to deal with these kinds of emergencies. So we want to avoid this kind of stuff. All right. So is it safe? Well, now that I've put a little bit of the fear of the MR gods into you, for the majority of the exams, yes. But why? Why? Like, what is it that is keeping us safe most of the time? How effective are the recommended safety measures? And what are some of the conditions that enable safe MR practice? And these questions are what I've been looking at in terms of addressing MR safety processes and policies. So what are we concerned about when it comes to MR safety? You've already gotten some hints because of what I've talked about already. Well, first of all, which I haven't mentioned, is instrument safety. There actually are guidelines that are applied to medical devices, including MR scanners, that ensure that electrically and mechanically, these are safe devices to be around, to lay down on and to submit yourself to an MR examination. We're also concerned with devices in the MR environment. So if you need to have an electrocardiograph while you're in there, or you need to have some kind of an injection coming from a power injector, so these peripherals have to be checked out for the MR environment. You may have an implant, that also has to be checked out before it goes into the MR environment. And last but not least, bioeffects. So even sort of the plain Jane human beings who have no implants and need no peripherals, there are some possible bioeffects. So these effects arise from the various subcomponents and fields they generate in the MRI scanner, which you may or may not already be familiar with, but there are these three field generators: the main magnet, the RF field transmit system, and the gradient system. The hazards related to them are, of course, forces on ferromagnetic objects, which are on all the time. The cryogen system, the presence of liquid helium inside the MRI scanner, which in normal times you should never see. But should there be either a system failure or an intentional release of the cryogen, it can lead to some potential hazards for people in the area. The radio frequency, or B1 field, as a potential source of hazard, is mostly on the transmit side, which can produce heating, and that heating can produce burns. Now, most of the time when RF burns happen is because there is another device next to the patient, and there's RF heating of this sort of system, right? The device-patient system that results in electrical currents, and the electrical currents raise the local temperature, possibly resulting in burns. And when they do happen and they get reported, it's usually because an MR unsafe device was used. It's extremely rare that it happens with devices that have been approved for use in the MR environment. The RF field, just like the main field, also possibly results in disruption of active devices. So pacemakers, neurostimulators, drug delivery pumps, etc. They're sensitive electronic devices. You stick them into a magnetic field, they don't like it. Gradient field system's main hazard is potential hurting of your hearing apparatus. Very loud acoustic noise, not to be confused with imaging noise. And so we will put in hearing protection. The second possible hazard is peripheral nerve stimulation, which is a temporary stimulus. It's caused by gradient field switching. This can go from a tiny tingling sensation up to a tapping and even discomfort or painful stimulus. It's usually anatomically specific, and it's usually limited well below anything that would cause cardiac stimulation. So if you see the plot here, what you have is stimulus strength on the y-axis and stimulus duration on the x-axis. And there's this sort of region of operation that remained white, where we have this no stimulation words come up. Whereas if we can keep in these regions of operation, we are extremely unlikely to produce nervous stimulation. So far, I've talked about MRI and its inherent hazards, some of which are on at all times, and some of which are on only during imaging and mostly concern the patient. So I bring back this slide of what are we concerned about? Instrument safety, devices in the MR environment, and bioeffects. Well, there's a whole bunch of documentation. I put the covers up on here, documentation from the IEC, from the FDA, from the ASTM. These are internationally active organizations that mandate how medical devices have to be tested before they're deployed out into the field, and the devices that we introduce into the MR environment as well. Right? So all of those are typically tested under the IEC, ASTM, or FDA standards. And then there are some more site-specific or site-specific safety documents, safety guidance from various bodies like the American College of Radiology, the Royal Australia New Zealand College of Radiology, the UK Medical Health Devices. No, it's MHRA. I forget what the exact acronym is, and other such professional bodies that mostly deal with the sort of end user, tell the end user how to behave, what processes, what workflows to put in to be able to ensure safe examination. So we rely on everything from system design and engineer-based testing all the way down to technologist training and procedures for MR exams. Some considerations include how the facility is designed, the operational culture of the institution, some technical considerations, which I've already alluded to, and then some exam and patient-related considerations. So culture of safe MR really comes from strong staffing, good knowledge, good training, having a clear chain of command within the clinic, up-to-date policies and procedures, and making sure that workflows are established and followed. That goes without saying that there should be some emergency preparedness. Here you see, for example, a graphic that's used in our own department to guide, visually our staff in the case of a code blue in the MR environment. We have to give consideration to everything you see up on the screen here, which is a bit of a visual mishmash of what I've talked about so far. So facility design is right in the middle there, showing how we partition off the MR suite, the MR department, into zones of various hazard levels, from zone 4, the highest risk, down to zone 1, the zone lowest risk, and then visuals of different devices that may come into the MR environment and how we have to think about that. One of the things that is continuously growing is the availability and diversity of MR systems. So if you look in here next to the green check marks, there are a 3T and a 1.5T scanner on that sort of left to right spectral axis. Those are the most commonly deployed MRI scanners in hospital-based settings or private diagnostic imaging settings. There used to be more and more of these systems operating down below 1 Tesla. They're making a comeback. Devices such as the ones well to the far left, well below 1 Tesla, this is a mobile MRI system. They really have different considerations in terms of MR safety needs, workflows, and environmental design. So really need to start thinking very broadly about MR safety practice for these various system designs. And all the way to the right, now clinically approved 7T MRI systems, which need their own, if you want, MR safety considerations. I won't belabor the point too long around exam-related and patient-related considerations. I think we can move on quickly, but I will mention that patient devices and implants are one area where we spend a lot of time discussing within the clinic, sort of, well, a lot of time, but this does come up pretty regularly. So devices and implants, I should be plugged in here. I don't know why I'm getting this low power. Devices and implants that are used to help sustain, maybe life-sustaining or function-sustaining for various patients. And so consideration of each device and implant as it comes through is very important for each individual patient. And so departments and institutions need to have clear procedures for screening and clearing of these devices before the patient goes into the MRI. I'll skip over the labeling and terminology, but I will now sort of bring it into a context of my own work, where I do work quite a bit in clinical efforts to support the development of policies and procedures, to provide training and education, support hospital staff in their screening efforts, and then after the fact, when we have incidents, helping to review those. And I work very closely with two individuals you see up on screen here, Evan McNabb and Véronique Fortier, who are physicists affiliated with the Department of Radiology. And we have a bit of our own ad hoc MR physics group at the MUHC. I find myself very fortunate to be able to work with these two individuals. So some of the questions that have come up over time now, switching gears a little bit, that have arisen out of my clinical work and thinking of MR safety and look at MR safety policy and procedures are listed up here. There are 4 of them. And what I'd like to do for the rest of this presentation is give you a glimpse onto how we've looked into the research into these issues. So can we improve screening efficiency at the MUHC, and more specifically within radiation oncology? There are often questions that come up. There are often small conflicts that can come up, whether the patient could go into MRI or not, and whether there needs to be extra information and it causes delays. So that's something we've looked at. Another question I've had the fortune of working with a group on is whether RT, radiation therapy accessories, are okay in the MR environment, and how so, and how can we think about that? And then a couple of more recent projects trying to quantify the effectiveness of MR safety measures from a design perspective, and then what baseline assumptions are made about the MR working environment. And I'll put some context on each of these questions as I go along. So over the summer of 2023, leading to sort of a bit of a summary presentation in October 23, we looked at MR safety patient screening form issues here in our own department in radiation oncology at the McGill University Health Centre. This is work I did with Gabriela Stroyan, who is another medical physicist here, for the benefit of the event reporting subcommittee of the radiation oncology department. And this actually led to a presentation at M&M rounds provided by Dr. Kopek. So this is showing some of the data and conclusions that we did. So our motivation was that ultimately screening, as I've tried to make the case so far, helps mitigate patient risks for MR examination. Good practice MR screening should really have 3 steps, 2 in writing, 1 verbal, and we try to follow that very closely. But the written forms, when they come with errors, can result in a greater risk to the patient or examination delays. The patient be delayed by an hour or can be told to come back on another day. So there are a variety of incidents in our incident reporting system, the SAIL, or Safety Incident Learning System, SAILS, that serve as sort of concrete examples showing either delays or canceled examinations. So what we looked at was our MR safety screening data. So it's a retrospective analysis combining information from ARIA from January 2023, I apologize, that's a typo, and a retrospective collection of screening forms from March to July 23. So in total, we looked at 379 safety screening forms, so 379 exams. And we coded the data according to whether the form is complete or incomplete, so whether some questions had been left out blank or not, and whether or not the MR technologist had made any written corrections on a printout of the sheet. They print out the sheet as part of their process. If they had made corrections by pen to add any information. And then we coded whether the correction, we coded the correction based on a severity scale. And we just coded the highest severity scale correction. So in terms of screening form completion, the rate was pretty good, 84%. So not that many forms were left with some blank questions. So there's a bit of room for improvement, but that was not the biggest problem. The biggest problem we saw was in the accuracy of the screening correction. And so well over half, in fact, 65% in this sample of screening forms had required some kind of correction. So on the day of the examination, when the form was printed up, the patient was sitting in front of the MR technologist and being asked the questions again. The technologist would make corrections. So now those corrections can sometimes mean, okay, we'll need to make a phone call before we scan you, or we can go ahead and there's no problem, to sometimes there's a 20-minute or 2-hour delay, or you'll never be able to be scanned, or you'll have to be scanned in a day from now when we have more information. So it can lead to various delays. So our severity scale went from red, which was an absolute contraindication or level 1 contraindication, all the way down to 5, which I've coded in blue, where is this an issue we can deal with on the day of the scan. And in between that, there are a few levels. So orange showing that we need more time for research or new info for the patient. Yellow is just new research, and green is something that we would need to know that would help with preparation. And what we found on these corrections is that the vast majority of the corrections, well, maybe not vast majority, but the majority of corrections were actually of level 2 severity, which meant that we would need additional information either from the patient or from the patient's record before proceeding with the MR examination. So this means extra research, making phone calls, asking the patient for more information, asking the patient to get information from their physician. So these are all steps that introduce greater and greater delays. Some of the most common form corrections were surgeries, and then some interesting ones, some important ones that we can't really deal with on the day of the examination, how their cataracts were corrected, whether or not they were claustrophobic, and whether or not they had kidney dysfunction. I'm going to focus on surgeries in terms of discussing this because the surgeries are not usually a contraindication, but they're a marker for a potential implant. And if the patient says, well, I had surgery 20 years ago on this part of my body, and I'm not sure if they put anything in there, that is automatically a pause on the process where we say, well, what could they have put in there? Consulting, looking back in their records, maybe even having a radiograph, looking at past imaging to figure out whether or not this patient can go to the MRI. So reporting of surgeries in and of itself is not the end answer, but it is important for us to do the adequate screening. So where did all this data take us? Well, to 3 next steps. We are revising our screening form to change the order in which we ask the questions and put emphasis on the ones that have a greater failure rate. We're strengthening our screening workflow, so working with the office that does the booking and our physicians to provide education, and working on improving our workflow for screening and training, as I said, of all staff involved. So our metric for improvement will be related to some prospective data collection, hopefully to mark down some of the delays and cancellations that we see related to screening. I'm going to switch gears now and come to my second research question, was to address the use of radiation therapy accessories in the MR environment. So more than a couple of years ago, not maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I was invited by colleague Maritza Hobson, who actually used to be at McGill, was one of our clinical physicists until a few years ago, to join AAPM Task Group 334. And Maritza and the colleagues you see up here, who come from various American hospitals and universities, some of them are from industry, we're getting together to look at the use of these immobilization devices and accessories in the MR environment. So growing use for MR simulation, so bringing immobilization devices into the MRI scanner to get the patient into the treatment position for the simulation session, or literally bringing the device into the MR LINAC environment for treatment. So some considerations around it. So our goal was to provide guidance on the safe and effective use of these devices. in the MR environment. And the considerations that we mostly focused on had to do with understanding or explaining and providing information about MR safety labeling, providing information about device testing, and then evaluation of devices, of specific devices for clinical use. So a little bit of the motivation here is shown in some of the pictures. You're seeing two setups. The images were provided by a colleague of one on the task group of two setups, one for head and neck MR guided radiation therapy setup, and the lower left is for a thoracic treatment setup. And in both cases, you see immobilization devices. So you see the masks here placed on the patient. You see this back lock device, hand holding device back here. So various items they use for patient immobilization. And you also see the MRI receive coils. So see, for example, here in production here. So guiding the community into towards a safe use of these various items was our goal. So ultimately, I've talked about some of the guidance that's listed up here, but we were mainly interested in some of the testing standards that have to do with devices. And when it comes to testing standards for devices going into the MR environment, they're mostly interested in patient implants, whether they are passive or active. So the ISO provides testing for testing standards for active implants. But the key word here is implants. We're mostly focused on stuff that's inside patients because that's the most common observation in diagnostic imaging. But now we're talking about external devices that are placed on or near the patient. So we noticed that there was much less attention given to devices used in this environment. So there were some unaddressed safety image quality concerns, and we needed some consensus on how to safely use these devices outside of existing recommendations. So we provided within this TG334, and it's now published, a review of device testing methods. These are contained within ASTM documents. We sort of package that all into a more sort of easy to read format and adapted. Oh, I apologize for that. Back. Screen share. Connecting. Oh, no. Actually lost my connection. Lost my connection to the meeting. Just give me a moment here. Okay, there we go. We should be back soon enough. Okay. So I was talking about the report of Task Group 334, which is now published and available online. We reviewed device testing methods and provided adaptations for external devices, so ways in which in-house devices can be tested, ways in which people could assess their devices, whether they acquired them commercially or not, policies and recommendations about policies, procedures, and how to educate their staff around the use of these devices, recommendations around inventory, recommendations around legacy devices. A lot of departments will already have a whole set of immobilization devices and then install an MRI system or an MR Linac. So how to integrate all of that into their practice. So Task Group 334 has gone through that exercise. So we provided workflows for evaluation of devices. We also provided recommendations on which staff, so whether it's an MRI qualified physicist, non-MRI qualified physicist, trained either residents or technologists or test engineers into who could perform various safety assessment tasks. Now, we also provided a workflow which, once devices had been cleared for MR safety, could be assessed for use within the RT environment. So, knowing something about electron density, how to integrate them into treatment planning, whether or not they fit into the MRI system, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think I've mostly gone over this enough, but our conclusions were that, there were now some clinical recommendations. We had reviews these testing methodologies and produced some useful information for people working in this area. So I'm going to move in now to the third question. So first we had talked about screening information, screening processes here at the MUHC Rad Onc department. Second, we talked about RT accessories in the MR environment. Now I'm going to move on to this sort of third research question in the MR safety area, which I've been doing mainly with Evan and Veronique, and that is to look at a concept called the hierarchy of controls. The hierarchy of hazard controls, as it is also known, places different approaches to protecting people from specific hazards in this hierarchy, as you see here. You might be reminded of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. In this case, it's no longer needs, but hazard controls. And at the very bottom, we place personal protective equipment, so the potentially least effective approach of protecting people, all the way up to, at the top of the hierarchy, elimination of the hazards. And in between, what we have are replacement of the hazard under substitution, engineering controls, so ways in which devices are set up to mitigate the risks that are involved in a specific procedure, and then administrative controls, providing education, training, workflows, and how people work. And so I thought that it would be interesting to use this hierarchy of controls and just kind of assess, look at, in a sort of a semi-critical way, what the MR safety guidance uses in terms of this hierarchy of controls. So we set out to assess MR safety practice using this tool. And hopefully this approach could serve to analyze choices in policy making or deployment of safety measures going forward. So the methods in this study were pretty straightforward. We started by identifying areas of risk. I've already listed these today for you when we revised sources of risk in MRI safety. We also sorted them based on groups of people and how they interact with the MRI system. So people who are being examined, people who run the scanner, and then anybody else, other hospital staff or family members, etc. We identified the various safety measures that come in the MR guidance documents, and then we gave them an efficacy score from 1 to 5. So 5 is the highest score, where we eliminate the risk, down to 1, the lowest score for personal protective equipment. And so we included all potential measures. So if there are measures to mitigate risk for a given source, there may be 2 or 3 or 4 ways in which we mitigate those risks. They were all included in the analysis. We didn't isolate any specific one. We scored each measure, and then as a way of collating the results, we looked at medians and ranges, which so far have been kind of a semi-useful way of looking at things. As a quick summary of what we have observed, the highest scores were actually obtained for the protection of non-MR personnel. So people who are not going into the MR environment largely. And then the scores for MR personnel and patients were pretty similar. So let's look at that very quickly. I won't show you all of the results of the study, but this is one of the an example of the tables that we produced. It's color-coded to show you the level on the hierarchy of controls. The various measures are in this column here. And so we sorted them based on their score, and then how they apply to the various individuals and their connection to the MR environment, and the checks are where these controls happen. Now you might ask yourself some questions. For example, how does the patient or a research participant avoid MRI? Well, ultimately there is a medical decision as to whether or not you send a patient to MRI and expose them to the related risks, and you have to weigh that against the diagnostic potential. That's always the first step in scheduling an MR examination. Looking critically at which MRI system is used when we have flexibility is a key question, which is an example of what can be used in terms of substitution of risk. We're, say, using a 3T scanner or an ultra-low field scanner, then there's a sort of substitution of risk that happens. When it comes to engineering controls, we saw that a lot of the ways in which we work in MR rely on these engineering controls. So devices that are designed to help mitigate the risk. For example, devices that can go safely into the MR examination or with very low risk. Having MRI systems that are equipped with a quench system that is tested on a regular basis, using ferromagnetic detectors to sort of have a last line of defense before entering the MR environment. And as I alluded to earlier, we talked about screening processes. Well, these fall into how people work. And there's a heavy reliance on screening of patients. I sort of talked to you how we screen every patient, we discuss every potential issue. Well, this is ultimately an example of a fairly low efficacy safety measure, right? They were basically based on how people work. So we have to be a bit not self-critical, but at least self-analyzing and self-aware when deploying these methods. So we summarized the scores here in another table. Without going through everything here, it's sorted by source of risk. And you see that for MR personnel, we're mostly in the range of a 3 median score with a good range for each technique. So there really is a lot of variability in what can be applied. At the other end, people who never enter the MR or very rarely enter the MR environment is a highly justified decision for protecting them from various MR safety risks. So this is a preliminary assessment of hazard controls in MR safety using a 5-point efficacy scale, which I believe could be used as a way of assessing guidance. So because there are variations between guidance documents, it could be a way of critically assessing different guidance documents. Policy choices. So hospitals do have the choice, for example, of having their patients undergo MR examination wearing their own clothes versus changing into a gown, which is a way of reducing risk as well. And then safety practices on the ground in everyday work. And maybe with the last few minutes that I have, I'll go into this last area of research which we've been thinking about, and this is with respect to the environmental conditions, and I'll define what I mean by environmental conditions. So where did this question come from? Well, last year I was invited to talk about cardiovascular device MR safety as part of the Scan With Me observership of the CAMERA MRI initiative. So the CAMERA MRI initiative aims to develop the use of MRI on the African continent. It is led by Uduna Anazodo, who you likely remember from this seminar series from a few months back. Uduna is very active in deploying imaging, image processing, and good MR practices in a number of African countries. And so as part of this Scan With Me initiative, which is one part of CAMERA MRI activities, I gave a lecture on cardiovascular safety. And following that, we started talking about potentially developing an entire MR safety training program, which we could give remotely to MR radiographers who work at sites that participate in the CAMERA activities. And so in developing that program, my initial reaction was to think, well, we can just use the training materials that we have here, right? We just reuse what we use to train our technologists. But then I asked myself the question, but are they working under the same environment? Are they in tertiary or quaternary care hospitals? Do they have access to an attending radiologist who is on site at all times? Is there even a nurse in the facility? Are their monitoring devices MR compatible? Is their suite set up to implement the 4-zone safety system? So there's all these questions that are basic assumptions about how hospitals are designed in the US market, in the American market, in the UK market, that may or may not apply. So we took a step back and started thinking, okay, what are the assumptions that are made in the guidance documents that we need to first ask about so we could collect some information about that? So there's guidance available from a variety of sources. You'll see, I'll give you some examples in a couple of minutes. And then these recommendations actually make select assumptions about the working environment. I've listed this. So our aims were to gather these recommended conditions from the guidance documents. And then as kind of a bonus on this is to start to identify consensus recommendations and where the guidance have different opinions. So it's a bit of a comparative analysis. So as part of this exercise, I put together this little timeline of the development of MR safety guidance. Now, this isn't yet all encompassing. There may be missing documents on this, but you'll see that MR guidance or MR safety guidance documents, when it comes to site-specific safety, so hospital guidance, goes all the way back to at least 2002. So over 20 years, there's been sort of this ongoing development of MR safety guidance. Engineering guidance for medical devices, MRI as medical devices, goes actually all the way back to 1995 from the IEC. And for the purposes of this study, we've been focusing on guidance from the UK, the SCORE-BAMR joint document, guidance from the US, the ACR document, Australia and New Zealand as well. And I forget to include in here the MHRA document as well. So for now, we've been able to analyze 4 of them. We have our hands on some other documentation from the European Union, from Brazil, and from Spain, and the analysis of that is ongoing. So we identify the guidance documents as we're ongoing. We extract the environment conditions. So what do the documents say you should have in order to practice safe MRI? Pull those out into a long table, figure out which one talks about which importance, and then try and compare and identify the status. And the documents we've analyzed so far are listed here. And just to add a little bit of information to this analysis, I looked at the countries where this guidance originates and what kind of population this represents. So it's on the order of a total population of about 440 million. So not hugely representative on the world scale, quite representative on the MR usage scale in some sense, because we've got sort of a range of MR system density, if you want. The use of MRI varies between countries. The availability of MRI systems and in these countries, which are all, as you might say, leading MR or leading in the MR development, anywhere between sort of 9 scanners per million inhabitants to about 38 for the USA. So this is just to put some perspective on the guidance. And this world map here shows in green the countries that we've covered so far. In yellow, the countries where I've identified some kind of documentation or publication related to MR safety, whether it's a survey, a beginning national document for protecting workers, all kinds of information. So we're still analyzing that. And orange are countries which we have looked at, but not yet identified relevant literature. So the search is ongoing. And in gray, we're still working our way down the list. The initial selection of countries to look at has largely depended on the density of MRI systems. So you can get OECD information about how many MRI systems per million inhabitants are present in a country. And we sort of started going down that list one by one. So I will not walk you through these entire tables here. This is where I've gathered the information, but I've color-coded it so that there's a bit of a quick read. We've generated we've generated tables for facility-related environment conditions surveyed in this work, MR system-related conditions, and equipment, so peripheral equipment-related conditions. And you'll see the color coding here. In green means that there is a strong consensus, usually unanimous consensus amongst guidance documents surveyed, that those conditions should be met as part of the good MR safety practice. In red at the other end is where there are either differences of opinion or appearance in only one guidance document, so really an absence of consensus. And then in yellow are where we have partial consensus. So 2 or 3 of the documents suggest that those conditions should be met. I want to be careful here in using the word consensus as well, because ultimately consensus is something that is arrived at through discussion and conversation. Now, I'm obviously assuming that the authors of these various guidance documents may know of each other, probably even read each other's documents, but I am not assuming that they have come to individual meetings and built consensus, right? So in this case, the definition of consensus is really appearance, explicit appearance within the document. So it's not to say that when there's no consensus over a particular condition, that there is debate over that condition. It may be a perfectly fine condition to impose, just that maybe 2 or 3 of the documents have just omitted to mention it. They've not even put it in explicitly. Now, when it comes to safety guidance, I would argue that if you don't mention something in the safety guidance, and it's still something that's useful, it is missing. All right, I'm not sure what's going on here. All right, so I've mentioned you'll see tables here showing facility-rated environment conditions, MR system-related conditions, and last but not least, equipment-related conditions. You see that there is a bit of a division, almost that one-third split on whether there is consensus, partial consensus, or no consensus at all. Let's mute that over here. Right. Over various environment conditions. So from this, what's next? Well, we see that there's a variety of recommendations, and there can be some differences in whether guidance is explicitly mentioned or conditions are explicitly mentioned in guidance or not. And this is going to influence how we develop the training for our CAMERA colleagues, based on then a response from them as well as to what working conditions they have based on the information that we have gathered. All right. Bit of a whirlwind tour. In summary, these various sort of research questions have led to, for some instances, meaningful and practical intent to change the way we work at our hospital in terms of screening efficiency. They've led to broad stroke guidance around the use of accessories in the MR environment for radiation therapy treatment planning. And then more recent, sort of still in development work to look at effectiveness from a design perspective and assumptions made in MR safety guidance. So initiatives 3 and 4 are ongoing. I failed to mention as I was going along that the initiative 3 on the hierarchy of hazard controls was recently presented at the ISMRM annual meeting. Thanks to Rene and Jorge who attended the meeting and were at the poster in my stead. And initiative number 4 is going to lead to probably a survey of the eventual audience for MR safety training to help guide the development of the training program, as well as hopefully a publication around the comparative analysis and maybe a more exhaustive survey of guidance from around the world. One thing I didn't mention as I was going along here is where Canada sits in this entire spectrum. So for the moment, Canada does not have national standards for MR safety guidance. There are some provincial standards that are applied within the healthcare system in certain provinces. And the professional associations, whether they are radiologists, technologists, or physicists, have made recommendations as to what guidance to use. And most of the time we look to our American colleagues, guidance that has been developed by the American College of Radiology. The American College of Radiology guidance happens to also be the de facto standard outside of areas where there is nationally defined standards. Does that mean it should be the only guidance we follow? I think maybe there's a bit of room for discussion around what gaps there might be in that guidance, and we'll try and identify that. But I think in terms of Canadian guidance, we could be doing better. We could have stronger local suggestions, local recommendations, and even enforcement. We could probably do better in terms of incident reporting and having at least either provincial or national incident reporting system for MR-related incidents. And so, these are things that are goals to shoot for from a community perspective. And I believe that brings me to the end of my talk. So I'd like to acknowledge the contributions and collaboration and input of Evan McNabb and Véronique Fortier, who I've mentioned already and have been active in helping me with the hierarchy of hazard control study. Students in my research group, Jorge Campos, René-Claude Bider, and Jules Fauché, who are actively involved in the study of environment conditions. Neil Kopek, Gabriela Stroyan, and other members of the event reporting subcommittee in Radon, who were very heavily and still involved in revising how we do patient screening in radiation oncology. Maritza Hobson, who I've mentioned, and other colleagues from the AAPM Task Group 334. Throughout this talk, I had not mentioned so far, but there are people I work very closely, the MR simulation team here at the MUHC, a group of high-functioning technologists who operate our MRI scanner, and then acknowledge funding from a couple of different sources that have been helpful over the years to either fund my lab or my own salary. So with that, I've left too little time for questions, possibly, but I'm happy to take some and carry on the conversation. Thank you.
Well, we can field questions for you.
I think Sarah has
a question.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Thanks for the talk, Eve. I was recently asked about the safety of repeated exposure to contrast agent in MRI. I didn't have much to say on that because I don't know much about it, but I was wondering if you could comment on that.
I can tell you what sort of the broad strokes policies are, and I can tell you a little bit about what our supplier will tell you. So the product monograph for the contrast agent that we use here for otherwise healthy adult patients will recommend a 24-hour waiting period between successive injections. And this is an agent that is passive and is cleared out through the kidneys. So as long as your kidney function is normal, repeated MR exams with contrast agents are relatively safe in that sense. Does that mean that daily contrast enhanced MRI scans for a week would be a safe practice? I would personally advise against that. I also struggle to see how that would be useful from a clinical perspective. But I can tell you that many patients who have, say, annual follow-ups or even quarterly follow-ups will receive contrast agent injections at each of those examinations and do not otherwise see effects. Now, there are some caveats to what I've said. People who have poorly functioning kidneys, especially at the very low end, people who are on dialysis, for example, or people who might have acute kidney failure, so sometimes inpatients having followed certain procedures or on certain medications, we have to be extra careful about that. We may not even give them contrast agent in the first place, and if we do, it won't be in a repeated fashion. There are reports in the literature of patients who have had repeated contrast injections, and not necessarily closely spaced, maybe even over the years, of remaining enhancement. I believe the reports were in certain brain structures. Now, the clinical implications of that remaining enhancement are not well known, not well understood. So the gadolinium pathway is essentially that of calcium. So it chemically kind of ends up where calcium would. But we don't inject pure gadolinium, we inject chelated gadolinium. So for gadolinium to accumulate in the body, it actually has to detach from the molecule that is carrying it around the body and become sort of this chemically active gadolinium ion. So you're relying on quite a few processes here. It has to stick around inside the body, long enough to detach from its molecule and then be uptaken and stored inside the bodies. That has been reported to happen, but as I said, the clinical medical implications of this, I don't think are very well understood yet. If you look around the internet, you will see people who report having had multiple contrast injections and then suffering ill health effects. You will find those stories. And there are some famous people who, in fact, report this. I won't necessarily repeat their names, just not to publicize anecdotal evidence. But at the same time, it is something to think about. And there are people who are much more versed than me in the pharmaceutical side of this that are studying that question. The other thing to think about as well in terms of contrast agent safety, I've talked about sort of the chronic aspects, but there is sort of the very low risk, but the low risk of an acute side effect, which is essentially an allergic reaction. And the allergic reaction rates to gadolinium-based contrast agents are actually lower than they are for iodine-based contrast agents. So they're kind of on that scale in terms of safety, if you want. So if you can take iodine, the risk of iodine contrast agent, the risk of gadolinium-based contrast agent is no worse.
Okay, thank you.
Do any of the guidance documents that you cited ever discuss contrast, or is that is a totally separate discussion?
So contrast agent safety is usually wrapped into MR safety, largely because they go hand in hand. There are a lot of exams that use gadolinium contrast agent, and so they do. They are used. They are wrapped into the same safety. And in fact, in some of the safety studies that I've seen, one of the most common causes of MR-related incidents are contrast agent related, either extravasations or an acute reaction or using the wrong dose or not using it at all. So contrast agent management goes hand in hand with good, safe MR practice. One of the things I have to be careful about, and my colleagues have to be careful about as MR physicists, is we are not ultimately the physicians who prescribe the contrast agent, and we are not sort of particularly well-versed necessarily in the pharmaceutical aspect. It is a pharmaceutical. It is a drug that is used in patients, and so we do have to defer to good clinical practice when it comes to, from the literature, and refer to our clinical colleagues who know and manage a lot more around patient pharmaceutical safety. Yeah. Question in the room here,
Yeah.
Gabriel?
More of a human resources question for you. What do you think we could do to better foster an environment where accidents or near accidents are reported? Incidents reporting seems to be difficult, and there's often an aspect of blame to them, even though that's not ideal. So what do you think we could do, as a medical community, to try to make our documentation of mistakes better?
Right. So the question was, what can we do from a sort of a medical community perspective to enhance safety and reduce the number of incidents ultimately? A lot of the incidents that are reporting are around screening and whether or not a patient will go into the MRI or not. And that relies on human processes, workflows. There are some things that can be done for this, like introducing a strict procedure where there are some people who have sort of a go, no-go decision-making that's well before the exam, and say, if the information isn't clear at this point, we will have to delay the MR examination. And putting that down and delaying MR examinations. Now, delays aren't great, and people are going to complain about them. And so then, it's a bit of a stick kind of an approach. There are other tools that are being deployed. They're not super widely deployed, but they are being deployed. Some of the vendors provide a software add-on to the MR console, which explicitly asks you about the presence of an implant and then allows you to input the safety conditions for that implant to be worked on. So that is something that be done. It's a day of kind of work. I'm not a top-down kind of guy, but better knowledge and better enforcement top down within hospitals, maybe starting at patient safety from the hospital and working down towards the actual department, or environmental health and safety when it comes to worker safety. Supporting that and building a better sort of collaborative environment around MR safety. Whenever I write an MR safety policy, the first paragraph I write is about how it is a collaborative process and how we should all aim for safety and worker safety, for patient and worker safety in doing this, rather than, you know, I did my job, but you didn't do yours kind of an attitude. And changing attitudes is important. Doing away, I think, with attitudes of like these blanket attitudes of saying, oh, MR, but that's the safe modality. Just because what? There's no ionizing radiation, but there's other aspects, right? So dealing with that, I think, also is important. You know, having been someone who's worked in both radiology and radiation oncology, I have to say that the safety culture of radiation oncology is pretty solid and in a way easy to work with from that point of view, because people are aware that, you know, we should pay attention to this and learn from them. And so that has been helpful for work in our own department. I'm hedging my words here to kind of be diplomatic about this because, you know, you don't want to point fingers at gaps either. I think there was another question in the room here.
Yeah.
Melody?
Yeah.
Okay.
So since surgery was the most
Underreported, yeah.
common issue, I guess,
Yeah.
like because of the impact. So and you know, in Sudbury, the MR imaging is 24/7. You know,
Yep.
so you're going to be scheduled for a 2 a.m. imaging time, and you have to go. But if there's a delay, they can't call your doctor.
No.
Yeah. So they're going to reschedule you for another 3 months.
Yes.
So you have to wait that long.
Yes.
So why not implement some type of, like, when you get your surgery, also get a surgery card, kind of like your health card.
Yes.
That you would bring with you for MR.
Okay. So the question, the question / suggestion in the room here was, there could be some pretty severe constraints around clinical practice of MR, sometimes scanning in the middle of the night because of wait lists and making up for time. And it'll be very difficult to reach out to a physician to get information in the middle of the night. So instead of scanning you, they'll cancel it and bring you back in 3 months. And so why couldn't we implement a system of information given to the patient? For example, a card, a post-surgery card, that would give the patient information. And this actually connects back to Gabriel's question of what can we do from a community perspective or even a system-wide perspective. Those cards do exist. Those cards exist for devices that are implanted rather than for surgeries. So if you are given a pacemaker, you will be given that card. And that card will also, a copy of it might go into your electronic health record, if there is one, or might go into your paper file at your hospital if that's what they use. So those do exist. And some patients are very diligent about carrying that card around with them to all of their medical exams. Some less so, but we can't blame the patient for not bringing their cards. Having electronic health records that extend beyond the walls of each individual hospital would be another great way of dealing with some of these issues, because you can imagine a system in which I've scheduled you for an MR examination, and the people who are checking you for safety screening, they don't just have access to your whatever record you have at the MUHC, but they can see what you had done at Hôpital Notre Dame 5 years ago, and then at your Sudbury Hospital 20 years ago when you were still living there, right? Now, electronic health records are a whole beast unto themselves in terms of a conversation and how you implement them and how you deploy them. Some hospital networks are better at deploying them than others. They've made the effort, they use them, others less so. But those softwares usually have built-in modules for what's in the patient and is it compatible with an MR examination. They can be used in that sense. So those cards do exist. And as a side note to the cards, electronic health records that tell you in advance what the patient has. Now, one of the things I didn't mention about screening workflows, it's not done on the day of. If it's done on the day of, it's not following guidance. Guidance actually says, when I request your MR examination, I should be asking you the questions. Because why would I request an MR examination if you can't have one? Why should I wait until you show up at 2 in the morning, like you said, in Sudbury, to have you told, oh, you've got this infusion pump? No, you can't go into the MRI scan. Right? Like, no, I should have known that the day I was looking at you and thinking you should have an MR exam. So good screening practice actually does so weeks in advance. And in fact, provides the information to the MR facility, who will look at your form and say, oh yeah, they can come here. Or, oh, we'll need to do research. And then they do the research. So that when you show up on the day of the exam, in principle, they've answered those questions. In principle. And then they review that with you on the day of the exam. The screening on the day of should really be about what has changed in the last 3 weeks or the last 3 months, when you were requested to have an MR examination. Okay.
Yes. All right,
Okay.
that's it.
Yes.
Thank you, Eve. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you very much.
Very informative. I feel safer. I do. I liked your title.
Yes. Did you get the reference?
I was thinking it's a cake. Was it? Ah, it's a good show. Family friendly.